In the beginning, God created, and it was good. Yet man and his agency abdicated this design. Tempted by a hollow promise, we veiled ourselves in the shame and guilt of our own making. Yet in his goodness, God covered us. In his mercy, sent us away, and in his love, promised a plan of redemption and reconciliation. A promise whispered in prayers, predicted through prophecies, and foreshadowed through generations.
A promise of a son came to Abraham. Even in the twilight of his age, the stars would not match the number of his descendants. Though Isaac was sired, this still was not the fulfillment of God's promise. Because Abraham was tested when he laid his son on an altar, but he was not the one to pay the price upon that hill, for this was merely a brushstroke of the promise God was painting.
A promise of deliverance. When God's people were held captive, he sent Moses to display his authority, to be the arbiter for a nation that had only known oppression and death, and to shatter the bonds that held them. And yet, this was not the fulfillment of God's promise, for this deliverance was limited to a single generation, enslaved by the work of man. The coming deliverance would break the mastery of sin, death, and the grave for all.
A promise of majesty, wrapped in the humility of a shepherd. For when David was anointed, he was tested in the wilderness. And though he conquered, and was crowned, his rule was not the fulfillment of God's promise. For through David's line would come the greatest shepherd, the King of all kings, who knew no faults or failure, the one who would construct a temple in the hearts of all who believe.
It's a promise of a blessing bestowed by the high priest, one that incites a response of radical generosity, one displayed by Abram when he encountered the King of righteousness and peace. Though this was the essence of what was promised, it was not the fulfillment. For though precedent formed and a priesthood followed, it would be one high priest who would bring a blessing that could quiet every storm, feed every multitude, and tear the veil to allow access for all to come freely into the presence of God.
A promise that would mark the turn of an age, that a son would be born to a virgin, cradled in the humility of a manger but showered in the gifts of majesty, a light in the darkness, a blessing heralded by the heavens, a deliverer whose very name means and brings salvation. It is Jesus, the greatest promise, the one who fulfilled the work of the Father, the one who redeems and reconciles, the one whose very name brings peace and healing and victory. For unto us this child is born, unto us this son is given, and he shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Our greatest promise has been fulfilled in Jesus. And if God has not failed to deliver us in his greatest promise, we can continue to knock and cry out and push through the crowd to sing and declare that every promise finds its fulfillment in Jesus.